Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Samuel Bennett placed white flowers on the same park bench. Rain or shine, summer or winter. He came with a small bouquet, sat for 10 minutes, and left without speaking to anyone. People in town thought they knew the story. They said he was grieving his dead wife. They said the bench must have been where she used to sit. They said some men never recover from losing the woman they love. But they were wrong. Samuel was not bringing flowers to a dead woman. He was bringing them to a promise. A promise he made 40 years ago to a woman who never knew he came back for her. Then one morning, a quiet stranger named Margaret sat beside him and asked, "Who are the flowers for?" Samuel looked at the roses in his hands and whispered, "For the only woman I ever loved." He had no idea. She was sitting right next to him. Margaret Ellis had only lived in Willow Creek for 3 months. She moved there after her divorce became final, after the house was sold, and after her daughter told her gently, "Mom, maybe you need a place that doesn't know your pain." So Margaret chose a small town near the coast. It had quiet streets, an old bakery, a church with blue doors, and a park that looked beautiful in the morning light. At 62, Margaret did not expect life to begin again. She only wanted peace. Every morning, she walked through the park before breakfast. She liked the sound of birds in the trees and the way sunlight touched the pond. She liked being a stranger. No one knew about her failed marriage. No one knew how many nights she had cried in a kitchen that no longer felt like home. But after 1 week, she noticed him. An older man with silver hair and a dark coat. He came to the same bench every morning. Always at 8. Always carrying white flowers. He would place them carefully on the left side of the bench, sit beside them for a few minutes, and stare at the empty path across the park. Then he would stand, touch the back of the bench once, and leave. The first time Margaret saw him, she thought it was sweet. The second time, she thought it was sad. By the 10th time, she could not stop wondering. At the bakery, she asked about him. The woman behind the counter lowered her voice. "That's Samuel Bennett," she said. "Poor man. Comes every day." "Did he lose his wife?" Margaret asked. The woman shrugged. "That's what people say. But nobody really knows. He never married, far as I know." Margaret looked through the window. Across the street, Samuel was walking slowly with another bouquet in his hand. Never married. The words stayed with her. The next morning, Margaret reached the park earlier than usual. She sat on a bench near the pond and waited. At exactly 8 o'clock, Samuel appeared. He moved slowly, but not weakly. There was dignity in the way he walked, as if every step had a purpose. He wore the same dark coat and carried fresh white roses wrapped in brown paper. He reached the bench, placed the flowers down, and sat. Margaret watched him from a distance. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of something deeper than grief. It was not just sadness. It was waiting. The next day, she came closer. The day after that, closer still. And on Friday morning, without fully knowing why, Margaret walked to his bench and sat down beside him. Samuel turned his head. He looked surprised, but not annoyed. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "Is this seat taken?" Samuel looked at the flowers. Then he looked at her. "In a way," he said. Margaret almost stood. "I can leave." "No," Samuel said softly. "Please stay." For a moment they sat in silence. The park moved around them. A child laughed near the pond. A dog barked in the distance. Leaves shifted in the wind. Margaret looked at the flowers. "They're beautiful." Samuel nodded. She liked white roses. Margaret felt a small ache in her chest. "Your wife?" Samuel smiled sadly. "No." Margaret waited. He looked straight ahead. "She was supposed to be." The words were quiet, but they landed heavily between them. Margaret turned to him. "What happened?" Samuel folded his hands. "For 40 years, I thought she chose someone else." Margaret's breath caught for a reason she did not understand. Samuel continued. "I loved a girl when I was young. Her name was Claire Donovan. I was 25. She was 23. We planned to leave this town together. Margaret went still. Claire Donovan. That name did not exist anymore. Not on paper. Not in this town. Not in the life she had built. But it had once belonged to her. Before marriage. Before disappointment. Before Margaret Ellis. Samuel did not notice the change in her face. He kept talking. I left for Chicago for 6 months to earn money. I promised I would come back on the first Sunday of May. I told her I would meet her right here, on this bench, with white roses. Margaret's hands began to tremble in her lap. Samuel looked at the flowers. When I came back, they told me she had married another man 2 days before. Margaret closed her eyes. Because 40 years ago, someone had told her Samuel Bennett never came back at all. Margaret did not tell him who she was. Not that morning. She could not. Her heart was beating too fast, and the past had opened too suddenly. She stood from the bench and said she needed to go. Samuel looked at her with concern. Are you all right? Margaret forced a smile. Yes. I just remembered something. She walked away before he could ask more. But all day, Samuel's words followed her. Claire Donovan. White roses. The first Sunday of May. The bench. She had not heard those details from another mouth in 40 years. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with an old wooden box in front of her. She had not opened it since the divorce. Inside were photographs, letters, and the small pieces of a life she had tried to bury. At the bottom was a faded picture of a young man standing beside a blue truck, smiling like the whole world was still kind. Samuel. Her Samuel. She touched the photograph with shaking fingers. 40 years ago, he had left for Chicago. He told her he wanted to save enough money so they could start their life without begging anyone for help. I'll come back on the first Sunday of May, he had said. Right here, Claire had answered, touching the park bench. And I'll bring white roses, he promised. But May came, and Samuel did not. Claire waited on that bench from morning until sunset. She wore a yellow dress and carried a small suitcase. Every time someone came through the park, she stood up. Every time it was not Samuel, something inside her broke a little more. At dusk, her mother came and found her sitting alone. He is not coming, her mother said. Claire shook her head. He promised. Her mother gave her an envelope. Inside was a short note. Claire. I can't come back. Don't wait for me. Samuel. Claire read it once. Then again. Then she folded it carefully because her hands did not know what else to do. 2 weeks later, Daniel Ellis proposed to her. He was stable. Respectable. Approved by her family. Claire did not love him. But she was tired of waiting for a ghost. So she said yes. Years later, she became Margaret Ellis, because Daniel said Claire sounded too young and soft. Then life moved forward in the way life does when a woman stops asking for what she truly wants. Children. Bills. Dinner guests. A beautiful house. A lonely bedroom. And somewhere deep inside her, a bench in the park where she had left the girl she used to be. The next morning, Margaret returned to the park. Samuel was already there. The white roses rested beside him. He smiled when he saw her. I thought I scared you away. Margaret sat down. No, she said. You just reminded me of something. Samuel looked at the path. Claire used to say that memories were like waves. You could pretend not to see them, but sooner or later they touched your feet. Margaret almost cried. I like that. She was smarter than me. Did you ever look for her? Samuel's eyes changed. For years. Margaret turned to him. What happened? He sighed. When I came back from Chicago, her mother told me Claire had married Daniel Ellis. She said Claire had received my letter and decided she wanted a better life. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. What letter? Samuel looked at her. The one I sent when my father got sick. I was delayed by 3 weeks. I wrote to Claire and told her I was coming late, but I was coming. I gave the letter to her mother. Margaret felt cold. Samuel continued. When I arrived, her mother showed me a wedding announcement. Claire and Daniel. Smiling for the newspaper. Margaret remembered that photograph. She had not been smiling. Not really. My mother told me you never came, she whispered. Samuel froze. The park seemed to disappear around them. He looked at her face. Really looked. At her eyes. At her mouth. At the shape of grief that had aged but not vanished. What did you say? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. My name used to be Claire Donovan. Samuel stopped breathing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he whispered, No. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. Samuel looked at the flowers between them. Then back at her. I came back, he said, his voice breaking. Margaret covered her mouth. I waited. He shook his head as tears filled his eyes. I brought the roses. I wore the yellow dress. I stood here until dark. I came 3 weeks later. They told me you didn't want me. They told me you left me. The truth sat between them, heavy and cruel. 40 years had not separated them. A lie had. And the people who claimed to love them had helped it survive. Samuel stood up and walked a few steps away. Margaret stayed on the bench, holding the old photograph from her box. She had brought it that morning, though she did not know if she would have the courage to show him. Now it lay in her lap like proof of a life stolen in plain sight. Samuel turned back to her. Why didn't you tell me right away? Margaret wiped her tears. Because I wanted to know something first. What? She looked at the roses. I wanted to know if you loved the girl I used to be, or if you were only bringing flowers to a memory. Samuel's face softened. Margaret continued. I am not 23 anymore. I am not wearing a yellow dress. I have lived a whole life since then. Some of it was good. Some of it hurt more than I can explain. Samuel came back to the bench slowly. I know, he said. I am not 25 anymore either. He sat beside her again. For a while, they said nothing. There was too much to say, and none of it could return the years. Finally, Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old envelope. Margaret recognized her name at once. Claire Donovan. Her mother's handwriting was on the front. Samuel said, I kept this because I hated it. Then I kept it because it was the only thing I had left of you. Margaret opened it. Inside was the note she had believed came from Samuel. Claire. I can't come back. Don't wait for me. Samuel. But now, looking at it with older eyes, she saw what grief had once hidden. It was not his handwriting. It never had been. Margaret began to cry. My mother wrote this. Samuel nodded. I think so. She wanted me to marry Daniel. She wanted you safe, Samuel said softly. Margaret looked at him. No. She wanted me controlled. There is a difference. Samuel did not argue. He understood. The next few days were not easy. This was not a fairy tale where two old lovers found each other and forgot everything that happened. Margaret went home and cried for the girl on the bench. Samuel stayed away for 2 mornings, and the empty bench hurt more than Margaret expected. On the 3rd morning, she found him there again. But this time, there were no roses. Only 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside him. No flowers today? She asked. Samuel smiled gently. I realized I was bringing them to the past. Margaret looked at the coffee. And now? Now I thought I'd bring something for the woman sitting beside me. That was the first time Margaret laughed through her tears. They began slowly. Walks in the park. Coffee at the bakery. Long conversations about everything they had missed and everything they could still choose. They talked about Daniel, who had been a distant husband but not a monster. They talked about Samuel's father, whose illness had changed the timing of everything. They talked about Margaret's children, Samuel's quiet years, and the strange pain of grieving a life that almost happened. One afternoon, Samuel asked her to visit the bench at sunset. Margaret found him standing there with one white rose. Just one. Not a bouquet for a ghost. Not flowers for a promise lost in time. One rose for the woman in front of him. "I don't want to pretend we can go back," Samuel said. Margaret's eyes filled. "Good. Because we can't. I don't want to love you like you're still 23. She smiled softly. "Good. Because I'm not." Samuel held out the rose. "I want to know who you are now." Margaret took it. For the first time in 40 years, the bench did not feel like a place where something ended. It felt like a place where something honest could begin. A year later, people in Willow Creek still saw Samuel Bennett at the park every morning. But he no longer came alone. Margaret walked beside him. Sometimes they held hands. Sometimes they argued about where to eat breakfast. Sometimes they sat quietly, because not all love needs to speak to be real. And every Sunday, Samuel placed one white rose on the bench. Not for the woman he lost. Not for the years stolen from them. But for the promise they had finally stopped mourning. One morning, a young woman passing through the park smiled and asked, "Is this your special place?" Samuel looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the bench. Then she answered, "It is where I learned that love can be late and still be true." Samuel took her hand. And together they walked home. Because sometimes love does not return the years you lost. But it can still bring meaning to the years you have left. And sometimes, the person you waited for was waiting too.